Hello, I'm Rebecca McGeehee. I am a medical physiology student at UNE, and today in this lecture we will be looking at the hormonal control of implantation and early embryonic development. The story of embryonic implantation begins at approximately 6 to 10 days post-ovulation, when the blastocyte exits the fallopian tube and enters the uterus. The blastocyte is, of course, a zygote, meaning that the sperm and egg have fused. And at this point, the blastocyte is made up of approximately 100 cells. You can see in this image here that we're going to use to show the anatomy of the blastocyte. It is far more than 100 cells, but it unfortunately was the best online picture I could find. So here we go. As you can see, the blastocyte has a very distinct structure that allows it to implant in the endometrium and to eventually develop into an embryo. The outside layer, shown here in blue, is the chorion. It is an extra embryonic membrane that eventually will enclose the embryo and form the placenta, which in this image is shown here as the purple and red. The intercellular mass is made up of 4 parts. On the outside, we have the amnion, and that is shown with the yellow layer here. The amnion develops into the amniotic sac and secretes amniotic fluid. Next is the allantosis, which you can't really see, honestly, in this image, but it eventually forms part of the umbilical cord. Next we have the yolk sac, shown here, but this disintegrates early on, so we don't worry about it too much. And of course, finally, we have the embryo. So the implantation phase can be broken up into 3 distinct stages. First is the adplantation of the blastocyte onto the uterine mucosa. Second is the adhesion of the blastocyte to the endometrium, and finally is the infiltration and embedding of the chorion into the endometrium. So let's take a closer look. As I mentioned before, the developing embryo implants into the endometrium approximately 7 days post-ovulation. There is, in fact, a very small time window during the peak of the menstruation cycle termed the implantation window, during which this can happen. It begins approximately 7 to 10 days after the peak of our luteinizing hormone, in which the blastocyte may come into contact and fuse with the endometrial wall. It is believed that this process is assisted by the hormones estrogen and progesterone, and we'll go into this a little bit more later, because they cause a thickening of the endometrial wall, which makes it easier for the blastocyte to come in contact with that mucosal lining. So that is the implantation, and the next step is the adhesion of the blastocyte to the endometrium. The adhesion is attributed to glycoproteins that inhabit the surface of the chorion layer. However, the specific mechanisms for how this happens are still being understood and studied. So finally, the chorion must infiltrate the endometrium and embed itself into the endometrial wall. As we can see in this image, the cells that make up the chorion are called trophoblasts. Once the adhesion has occurred, the trophoblasts begin to rapidly divide and fuse to each other to become large multinucleated cells called syncytiotrophoblasts. These continue to grow and form finger-like projections, seen here, called chorionic villi. Chorionic villi release enzymes that break down the walls of the maternal blood vessels, creating pools of blood that surround the zygote. As fetal blood vessels eventually develop within the chorionic villi, they're able to come into very close but not direct contact with those pools of maternal blood. This allows for a transfer of nutrients and waste between the mother and fetus without actually mixing their blood. So as you might have guessed, this structure is what forms the placenta. So now that we understand a little bit about what's actually happening during the process of implantation, let's take a closer look at the hormones that regulate this process. I really liked this image because I thought it gave the best, most concise illustration of what's going on throughout the pregnancy. So immediately following ovulation, the corpus luteum begins secreting high levels of progesterone, a steroid hormone that's produced in the ovaries. And you can see that up here under our first trimester. Progesterone is responsible for preparing the uterus for pregnancy. One of the most important ways it does this with regards to implantation is by thickening the endometrium and increasing the density of blood vessels in the endometrium wall. As we touched on earlier, the thicker the wall is, the thicker wall decreases the space within the uterus, which therefore increases the chance that the blastocyte will come into contact with the endometrial wall once it has been released from the fallopian tubes. Progesterone is also essential to prevent menstruation, which if it were to occur would cause the shedding of the embedded blastocyte. So the corpus luteum is responsible for progesterone secretion until 7 weeks after fertilization. At that point, the developing placenta takes over progesterone secretion and the corpus luteum disintegrates. A quick aside before we move on, estradiol, which is a type of estrogen also produced in the ovaries, is another hormone that contributes to the thickening and increased vascularization of the endometrium. So how does the body know when the placenta should take over hormonal control? So that is the responsibility of a hormone called human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG. So you can see here it is essential during that first trimester. This peptide hormone is structurally similar to our luteinizing hormone, so much so that it can even use the LH receptors. So early on, HCG is secreted by the chorionic villi and is, like I mentioned, responsible for ensuring that the corpus luteum continues to produce progesterone to prevent menstruation. HCG is also what stimulates the production of testosterone in the embryonic testes if the embryo is male. HCG, as you can see here, is produced in such large quantities early on that this is the hormone that is used to detect pregnancies in both at-home and clinical testing. A third important hormone that is also produced by the placenta is the human chorionic somatomammatropin, or HCS, shown here in yellow. I had to add that one in. So this peptide hormone, similar to HCG, is very structurally similar to another hormone, this one being our follicle, or our FSH. Again, so much so that our HCS utilizes the FSH receptor sites. HCS used to be thought that this was the hormone largely responsible for lactation, which is why it is named the way it is. However, further studies have shown that this is most likely not the case. It is, however, extremely important in altering the maternal glucose and fatty acid metabolism in ways that support fetal growth. The complex interactions of not only these 4 proteins, but many others as well, are what prepare the uterus for implantation, and allow there to be a successful pregnancy. So let's summarize what we have covered in this brief introduction to the hormonal control of implantation and early embryonic development. Before implantation even occurs, progesterone and estradiol or estrogen ready the endometrium for implantation by the blastocyst by thickening the endometrial wall and increasing how vascular it is. When the blastocyte begins to adhere to the endometrial wall, the chorion villi infiltrate the endometrium and slowly begin forming the placenta. These villi secrete the hormone HCG, which ensures that the corpus luteum continues to produce progesterone, which is what is responsible for preventing menstruation. Around week 7, however, the placenta takes over hormone secretion. In addition to continuing to secrete HCG, it additionally begins secreting the hormone HCS. So as we went over, HCS is largely responsible for creating changes in maternal metabolism to promote fetal growth. It is also around this time that the placenta takes over secretion of estrogen from the ovaries. And this concludes our brief summary of the hormonal control of implantation and early embryonic development.